I'm Christine, and I make homemaking content for those who want to live more creative lives. Today I'm sharing my tried and true sourdough bread recipes. This recipe that I'm making now, I've been making for years. We absolutely love it, and I'm going to share my whole process with you today. I've been making sourdough bread for about 10 years now, so this isn't a new trend or a new hobby for me, and I learned it, I feel like, the old-fashioned way. I got a book, I read it like through and through, I reread it, and then I also practiced with my hands and applied what I was reading until it all clicked in my head. The book that I recommend is Tartine Bread, and he's out of San Francisco. He has a bakery, and he's developed just the perfect sourdough bread recipe. It's very true to tradition, and I've taken that recipe, I've used it for many years as an artisan loaf, but over time I've slowly modified it to fit the needs of our family a little bit better. Now I like to make it in a loaf pan, and I also change the ingredients just teeny tiny bit to make the bread a little bit softer, and I bake it a little bit differently because I want my kids to eat it. And this made it a little bit more family friendly because I could cut it into slices, make sandwiches, toast, all those sort of things. I have two recipes that I make. One is the one I just described to you, and the other recipe is another one I just found online. It is using the bread machine, and it's basically a very hands-off, easy sourdough white bread sandwich loaf. I got this recipe through Sarah Therese Co. She has a whole video on it, but I'll just kind of show you, how I implement it into my life. That's the recipe I use for just like keeping the bread flowing. Like if we're running out of bread, I will make that one. It's not my favorite recipe as far as flavor and texture, but it definitely gets the job done. It definitely tastes good. It's very soft. It's just like a sandwich loaf, but it's made with sourdough, so it's healthy. It's got whole ingredients. There's no yeast in it. And this is primarily what I'm giving my kids for school lunches and things like that. But before we start, I need to show you how I take care of my starter. So I'm going to go ahead and get that out and feed it because I'm going to make the soft sandwich loaf tonight using the bread machine. So I'll show you that first. I keep my sourdough starter in the fridge. I do this because I don't want to have to maintain it or worry about it all the time. And this works for me because I do bake frequently enough. You can keep your starter in the fridge for up to a week and you don't need to worry about feeding it. So when I know I'm going to bake, for example, today I'm going to be baking the sandwich loaf in the evening. So I pulled out my starter around midday and I'm going to feed it. It only needs about 6 hours for me to be risen and ready to use. My starter is very active. I actually got it from a local baker, and I recommend you do the same if you want to start with baking sourdough bread. So before I begin baking any bread, I discard all but 1 tablespoon of my starter, and then I feed it with 1 cup of flour and almost a cup of water. The reason you want to discard some of your starter before you feed it is because you want to start off with a small amount of starter and feed it with larger amounts of flour and water to get a really good balance. This becomes a young, fresh leaven, is what they call it. And when you have a leaven, then you're ready to bake a delicious loaf. So we're going to go ahead and set that to the side to use later in the evening. That evening, when my starter was ready, I added 1 1/4 cups of water to the bread machine bowl. And then I added 140 grams of bubbly sourdough starter. Then I add 1/4 cup of melted salted butter, 3 1/2 cups of flour, 3 tablespoons of sugar, and 1 teaspoon of salt. I add all of this together into the bread machine pan, and then I put the pan right into the bread machine and select menu number 12 for mine. This is a leaven cycle, so it's going to knead the dough and warm it up slightly, but it's not going to bake it. I'm gonna leave it overnight and it will do its thing, and I will see it in the morning. Now I'm putting my starter back in the fridge so I don't need to worry about it. This is the next morning. My dough has been rising all night and it is exploding. It is very active, and so it's just coming all over the sides, which is fine. It's not a big deal. This dough was on the warmer side because the room was on the warmer side. Therefore, it was stickier and harder to work with. Anytime you're making sourdough bread, you have to keep the room temperature in mind because it affects your baking times and rising times. So if your room is extra warm, you may want to let your dough rise for a shorter amount of time, or let your starter sit for a shorter amount of time. Anyways, I am adding some flour to my hands to try and get this dough workable. I'm shaping it into a loaf. I try to kind of stretch it and fold it and then roll it up to create a loaf shape, trying to not break the dough because the outside of the dough becomes the crust. So you're gonna go ahead and put this on parchment paper and stick it in a loaf pan and then let it sit for another hour or two until you're ready to bake it. Before you bake it, you may want to brush it with a little bit of butter. It helps bake the crust more evenly. And you're going to bake it at 375 for about 45 minutes. At least that's what works for me. I'm going to brush it with a little more butter, and this kind of gives the crust a little bit of a glossy look to it. And there you have it. This is a very easy sourdough bread recipe. If you just want to get started with sourdough and you're not ready for more complicated recipes, I highly recommend this one. The bread machine really makes this easy, approachable, and hands-off. Moving on to my favorite recipe, this is the tartine country bread loaf, but it's been modified for my family. The flavor in this is so developed and the structure of the bread is amazing. So I start off as usual with taking my starter out of the fridge. I'm discarding most of it, all but about a tablespoon, and feeding my starter a cup of flour and almost a cup of water. I'm going to cover that and set that to the side. When I make my tartine bread, I feed the starter early in the morning, about 6 a.m., and I mix my dough around noon. So I'm going to set this starter on the counter and come back to this later in the day. Around lunchtime, this is when I mix together my dough. My starter is nice and bubbly at this point, and I'm just gathering all of my supplies that I need. This recipe uses 100 grams of whole wheat flour, and for that I do like to grind it myself. I don't grind it every time I make this bread, but I noticed that I was getting low, so I'm doing another batch. This is my Nutri-Mill. I love it. So now I'm ready and I'm zeroing out my scale. I've got the water running. It's good to do lukewarm water for this. You need 700 grams of water, 200 grams of sourdough starter. You're gonna mix that together until the water becomes milky. And then you're gonna add in 100 grams of whole wheat flour and then 900 grams of all-purpose flour. I use either King Arthur flour or organic bread flour from Costco. You do want a good quality flour for this. You're gonna mix it together. It's not gonna be completely mixed when you finish with this part. You're just gonna get it until it forms sort of a lumpy dough. And once it gets to that point, I do pull out my scraper. This helps to kind of incorporate it just a little bit more, especially the dry bits on the bottom. And then I'm gonna cover it and set a timer for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, it's gonna look about like that. You're giving the flour a little bit of time to absorb the liquid, and this is an important part of making this bread. After that, you add in 20 grams of salt, which is about 1 tablespoon. This is something additional that I've added, and this is 60 grams of sugar. And then I'm adding in 50 grams of water just to get the rest, all of this incorporated. You're just gonna stick your hand in there and squish it until the salt and the sugar and the water kind of dissolve and incorporate into that dough. After 20 minutes, you're gonna come back and reach your hand in there and stretch that dough up and give it a fold on each corner of the dough. So imagine that your dough is like a square. You wanna hit each edge, and what you're doing is creating gluten structure. You're gonna come back in another 20 minutes. It's gonna look a little bit like that. And you're just gonna do it again. And every time you're going to put the lid back on it and set a timer. You're gonna do it every 20 minutes for the first hour, and then you're just gonna do it once every hour after that. Now, it's not a perfect science. If you go out and run errands and come back, it's okay. I've done it plenty of times. I've even brought my dough with me in the car before. But you just do the best that you can. And at the end of the evening, your dough should look more billowy, and it should definitely be more risen. The ambient temperature in your room is going to have a great effect on what your dough is going to end up like. Now I'm going to carefully dump the dough out onto the counter, flour it a little bit, and cut it in half and shape each half quickly into a round shape. This is called the bench rest. It's going to sit like this for 20 minutes, and that allows the gluten in the dough to relax and stretch even more to create a nice crust. While that's resting, I take out my pans and my parchment paper and get ready for the final shaping. Now I'm going to show you how I shape my loaves. I used to do a artisan round loaf that was rustic and beautiful, but I found that it was not as practical for us, and the end pieces weren't usable, and the crust was just chewier and harder on your teeth. So I decided to try doing these in a loaf pan instead, and that ended up working so good for us. So that's what I do now. I shape it by stretching the bottom portion up and folding it, and then the right side, and then the left side, and you just have to keep flouring your hands as it gets sticky so that nothing breaks as you're sticking to the dough. On the top, you're gonna kind of grab each corner and pinch it in, and then you're gonna roll from the top all the way down to turn it into a nice firm loaf. Then you're going to want to kind of apply a little bit of tension on the sides to create that structure again. And you can pinch in the sides if you'd like. And from here, once it's ready, you can put it right on top of the parchment paper and stick it inside of the loaf pan. And then go ahead and cover the loaf pan up, and you're going to put that in the fridge to rest overnight. And because this recipe makes 2 loaves, I'm gonna shape the next loaf so you can see how I do that one more time. I love that this recipe makes 2 loaves because this will last me almost the whole week, and then I fill in with that other recipe that I shared with you. So I feel like with these 2 recipes, that essentially makes up my weekly sourdough bread baking routine. I'm putting those loaves in the fridge overnight. This develops even more flavor and also prevents it from getting sour because it's a cold fermentation. So now I'm just giving my kitchen a quick clean and scrub down. And if you're thinking that this recipe is just way too complicated and involved, you are right about that. But I am home a lot, so it works for me. And I've been doing this for so many years that it's second nature. I know what I'm doing. I don't need to look at a recipe book. It's just a routine. So if it's something you're interested in doing, I suggest that you just learn and put it into practice, and you might find that it works in your life as well. So this is the next morning. I've gotten my kids off to school, and now I'm pulling it out and preheating the oven to 400. I'm making sure that the rack is not too high because I want the bread in the middle rack. And I'm gonna go ahead and use a razor blade that I have for scoring the top of the loaf. So at an angle, I make one long slice, and then I like to do a little pattern of like a zigzag pattern, which also helps the dough to rise a bit more. I'm tenting foil over the loaves, which helps to trap the steam, and I keep that foil on for 40 minutes. And then I take the foil off for the last 10 to 13 minutes or so until the loaves look like a nice golden brown color. You're going to want to take these out of the pan right away and let them cool on a rack for at least 2 hours. I like to brush it with some butter right after baking so it creates a glossy crust. It also keeps the crust softer. It's good to wait for it to cool before you cut it, because if you cut it too soon, the texture of the loaf does change. It's not a big deal. I mean, we all cut into hot loaves of bread at some point in our lives, and that's great. But I do try to wait because it's also much easier to cut when it's cooler. So because this is so fresh, it's a little bit harder to cut, but I do love my Ballerina Farm knife. It's the best sourdough knife I've ever had. This bread is so amazing. Until you make it and try it, I just don't know how to describe it to you. It's the best bread I've ever had. I'm making my husband a quick sandwich for lunch. So yummy. Okay, so for my lunch, I love to make an egg and cheese sandwich. I use Kerrygold white cheddar cheese, and I stick that in the toaster oven to melt the cheese, and then I fry an egg, and it's just so simple and quick and easy. So this is my go-to lunch every day. Sometimes I'll smash an avocado on there, maybe a tomato if I'm feeling fancy, but even just this by itself is perfect. Another thing I love to make in the afternoon, it's like my afternoon delight, is I toast a piece of bread and I make a gorgeous hot cup of coffee. And then I smear some natural peanut butter on there, as well as some creamed honey that I got from Costco. It is so yummy. And then I just like to sit down and have a moment with my little treat and refuel in the afternoon. Look at this coffee. Oh, peanut butter toast. Cheers.